When governments start celebrating victories no one can see, the end is already here. On October 7, 1989, East German leader Erich Honecker stood before international media in East Berlin and declared the resounding success of the German Democratic Republic's economic system. He proclaimed that socialist planning had achieved unprecedented prosperity, that the East German economy was stronger than ever, and that the capitalist West could learn valuable lessons from their superior organizational methods. Honecker spoke with complete conviction about victories that were obvious to anyone who understood the mathematical reality of socialist economics. 43 days later, the Berlin Wall fell. Within 1 year, East Germany had ceased to exist. Honecker's victory declaration wasn't propaganda designed to fool international observers. It was psychological necessity driven by institutional dynamics that appear in every governmental collapse throughout history. When systems enter terminal breakdown, authorities don't acknowledge failure. They proclaim success with increasing intensity until mathematical reality overwhelms official narrative. This pattern isn't unique to communist regimes, it's universal across all governmental systems during collapse phases. Democratic governments, authoritarian regimes, monarchies, and republics all follow identical psychological progression when facing systemic breakdown. The victory declarations become more emphatic as actual conditions deteriorate because institutional psychology requires authorities to maintain legitimacy narratives until the moment legitimacy becomes impossible. Today, Western governments are following the same pattern with disturbing precision. Victory declarations about inflation control, economic recovery, financial stability, and social progress are becoming more frequent and more emphatic, while observable reality moves in opposite directions. The psychological dynamics driving these declarations are identical to those that preceded every major governmental collapse in modern history. Understanding why governments always declare victory before collapse requires recognizing the institutional psychology that governs official decision-making during systemic breakdown. Government officials don't choose to lie about systemic failure. They psychologically require victory narratives to maintain functional capacity while facing mathematical realities that make continued governance impossible under existing frameworks. The psychological mechanism begins with cognitive dissonance between official responsibilities and mathematical realities. Government officials are psychologically invested in system success because their identities, careers, and self-worth depend on governmental effectiveness. When mathematical evidence indicates system failure, cognitive dissonance creates psychological pressure to reject evidence rather than identity. This psychological pressure intensifies as system problems worsen because acknowledging failure would require officials to admit that their life's work has been destructive rather than constructive. The psychological cost of such admission exceeds most people's emotional capacity, creating unconscious bias toward information that supports system success regardless of mathematical accuracy. Soviet leadership during the 1980s provides the clearest historical example of this psychological dynamic. Mikhail Gorbachev, Eduard Shevardnadze, and other senior officials genuinely believed that perestroika and glasnost would revitalize the Soviet system. Their victory declarations weren't cynical manipulation, but sincere conviction that reforms would demonstrate socialist superiority over capitalist alternatives. Soviet economic statistics during the late 1980s showed consistent production increases, technological advancement, and social progress that appeared to validate leadership optimism. The statistics were mathematically fabricated, but Soviet officials believed them because psychological necessity required belief in system viability. Acknowledging statistical manipulation would have required acknowledging systematic governmental failure. The psychological investment in victory narratives becomes self-reinforcing because officials surround themselves with subordinates who provide information supporting predetermined conclusions. Bureaucratic advancement requires supporting official optimism, creating institutional selection pressure that eliminates dissenting analysis from decision-making processes. This creates information bubbles where governmental leaders receive only data that confirms system success, while contradictory information is filtered out through institutional mechanisms. The leaders genuinely don't know that their victory declarations contradict observable reality because institutional psychology prevents accurate information from reaching decision-making levels. Venezuelan leadership under Nicolas Maduro demonstrates this dynamic with contemporary clarity. Maduro consistently declares victory over economic challenges while Venezuelan citizens experience hyperinflation, food shortages, and infrastructure breakdown. His declarations aren't conscious deception, but psychological necessity that allows continued governance despite mathematical evidence of system failure. Maduro's victory celebrations for socialist economic achievements occur simultaneously with mass emigration, currency collapse, and social breakdown, because institutional psychology requires authorities to interpret all evidence through success frameworks. Each declaration becomes more emphatic as contradicting evidence accumulates, because psychological dissonance increases pressure for narrative reinforcement. The institutional momentum behind victory declarations creates feedback loops that accelerate rather than prevent systemic breakdown. Officials who believe their own success narratives implement policies that address imaginary problems rather than actual problems, making real problems worse while creating additional problems that require additional victory declarations. This psychological dynamic explains why governmental responses to crises consistently appear disconnected from crisis realities. Officials responding to perceived success implement different policies than officials responding to perceived failure. When institutional psychology requires success perception, policy responses become mathematically inappropriate for actual conditions. American governmental victory declarations about inflation provide current examples of this psychological dynamic. Officials proclaim success in controlling inflation while implementing policies that mathematically guarantee inflation acceleration. The victory declarations aren't cynical politics, but institutional psychology that requires positive interpretation of negative mathematical trends. The Federal Reserve's victory declarations about monetary policy effectiveness occur simultaneously with currency debasement, asset bubble creation, and wealth inequality acceleration, because institutional psychology prevents acknowledgement that monetary policies are producing opposite effects from stated objectives. Each victory declaration justifies additional policies that worsen underlying problems. This creates policy feedback loops where victory declarations lead to policy intensification that creates additional problems requiring additional victory declarations. The psychological mechanism becomes self-perpetuating because each victory declaration increases psychological investment in policies that mathematical evidence shows are failing. The timing of victory declarations provides critical information about systemic breakdown progression. Early-stage victory declarations occur during periods of apparent stability when problems are developing but haven't reached crisis levels. These declarations often prove accurate because systems maintain functional capacity despite underlying stress. Mid-stage victory declarations occur when problems have reached crisis levels, but institutional responses maintain appearance of control. These declarations contradict increasing evidence of system stress, but remain psychologically necessary for maintaining official functionality. The contradiction between declarations and reality begins generating public skepticism about governmental competence. Late-stage victory declarations occur when mathematical reality overwhelms institutional control mechanisms. These declarations become increasingly desperate and disconnected from observable conditions because psychological pressure for success narratives intensifies as evidence of failure becomes undeniable. This stage typically precedes collapse by months rather than years. Current American governmental victory declarations exhibit late-stage characteristics with increasing frequency. Inflation victory declarations occur during periods of accelerating price increases. Economic recovery celebrations happen during periods of declining real wages and increasing debt burdens. Financial stability proclamations coincide with banking sector stress and currency debasement. The frequency and intensity of these declarations suggest institutional psychology characteristic of late-stage systemic breakdown. Officials proclaim victories that require statistical manipulation to support because psychological necessity for success narratives exceeds commitment to mathematical accuracy. International examples demonstrate this pattern's universality across different governmental systems and historical periods. Argentine leaders declared economic victory repeatedly during multiple currency crises while implementing policies that guaranteed crisis acceleration. Turkish officials proclaim monetary policy success while currency devaluation and inflation create obvious contradictions to victory narratives. The pattern appears universal because institutional psychology operates according to consistent principles regardless of political systems or cultural contexts. When officials psychologically require success narratives to maintain functionality, they unconsciously filter information to support predetermined conclusions while rejecting contradicting evidence. Understanding this psychological dynamic explains why governmental performance consistently deteriorates after victory declarations. Officials, believing their own success narratives, implement policies appropriate for successful systems rather than failing systems. The policy mismatch accelerates actual failure while creating additional psychological pressure for victory narrative reinforcement. This creates mathematical progression toward collapse that operates independently of external conditions or policy adjustments. Once institutional psychology requires victory narratives that contradict mathematical reality, policy responses become systematically inappropriate for actual conditions, making system failure inevitable regardless of resource availability or external support. The media's role in victory declaration dynamics provides additional insight into institutional breakdown psychology. Media organizations face similar psychological pressures because their credibility depends on governmental legitimacy. When governments declare victory, media organizations psychologically require supporting evidence to maintain their own institutional viability. This creates media feedback loops where victory declarations receive supportive coverage while contradicting evidence gets minimized or ignored. The media amplification of victory narratives increases public confusion about system performance while reducing pressure on officials to acknowledge mathematical realities. Social media accelerates victory declaration dynamics by creating immediate public feedback that officials interpret through success narrative frameworks. Positive responses to victory declarations receive attention, while negative responses get dismissed as misinformation or political opposition. This confirmation bias intensifies psychological investment in success narratives. The public's response to victory declarations also follows predictable patterns during systemic breakdown. Early-stage declarations receive general acceptance because apparent evidence supports official claims. Mid-stage declarations generate increasing skepticism as contradictions between claims and experience become obvious. Late-stage declarations produce public cynicism that undermines governmental legitimacy. Current American public response to governmental victory declarations suggests mid to late stage systemic breakdown characteristics. Inflation victory celebrations generate widespread skepticism because personal experience contradicts official statistics. Economic recovery proclamations receive cynical responses because wage stagnation and debt increases contradict declared improvements. Historical analysis reveals that public cynicism about victory declarations typically precedes governmental collapse by 12 to 18 months. When significant portions of the population reject official success narratives, institutional legitimacy begins breaking down through psychological mechanisms that operate independently of policy effectiveness. This legitimacy breakdown creates additional pressure for victory declarations because officials recognize that public skepticism threatens their authority. The resulting declaration intensification accelerates legitimacy erosion by creating larger gaps between official claims and public experience. The mathematical impossibility of sustaining victory declarations indefinitely means that this psychological dynamic has built-in termination points where continued declarations become impossible, even for officials with maximum psychological investment in success narratives. These termination points typically occur when mathematical realities overwhelm institutional capacity for narrative manipulation. Current global governmental victory declarations suggest approaching mathematical termination points, where continued success narratives will become psychologically impossible even for officials with maximum commitment to positive interpretation. Inflation, debt, currency, and social stability metrics are reaching levels that exceed narrative manipulation capacity. Understanding victory declarations as psychological necessity, rather than strategic choice, provides insight into why governmental responses to crises consistently appear inadequate. Officials responding to perceived victories implement different policies than officials responding to perceived crises. When institutional psychology requires victory perception, crisis responses become mathematically impossible. This psychological dynamic explains why external observers often predict governmental collapse while internal officials remain optimistic about system performance. External observers analyze mathematical data without psychological investment in success narratives. Internal officials analyze same data through psychological filters that require positive interpretation for continued functionality. The universality of victory declarations before collapse indicates that this psychological dynamic represents fundamental limitation of governmental systems during stress periods. When mathematical realities conflict with institutional psychology, psychology typically prevails over mathematics until mathematical forces become overwhelming. Current governmental victory declarations about inflation control, economic recovery, financial stability, and social progress follow historical patterns that preceded every major systemic collapse in modern history. The psychological dynamics driving these declarations are identical to those observed during Soviet, Venezuelan, and other governmental breakdowns. The frequency, intensity, and disconnection from mathematical reality of current victory declarations suggest late-stage institutional breakdown psychology. Officials proclaiming victories that require statistical manipulation and media collaboration indicate psychological investment in success narratives that exceed commitment to mathematical accuracy. When governments start celebrating victories no one can see, the end is already determined by psychological forces that operate independently of policy adjustments or external interventions. The victory declarations don't prevent collapse. They accelerate collapse by creating policy responses inappropriate for actual system conditions. The pattern is universal, the psychology is predictable, and the outcome is predetermined by institutional dynamics that have operated consistently across all governmental systems throughout history. Victory declarations before collapse represent psychological necessity that makes collapse inevitable rather than strategic choice that might prevent collapse. The celebrations are getting louder while the mathematics are getting worse. The victory narratives are becoming more desperate while the contradicting evidence becomes more obvious. The end is already here for anyone capable of reading the psychological signals that governments always send. When they're psychologically preparing for collapse, they cannot publicly acknowledge